Hi, we're going to talk about coalitions and the stakeholders inside and outside of your coalition. So the purpose of a coalition is really, there are multiple purposes. One is you're trying to pull in information from as many sources as possible. You have data and research from as many sources as possible, and you have political and public will access as much as possible for a common outcome. The purpose of a coalition is to make sure that there is a unified voice speaking with a policymaker. Policymakers are famous for divide and conquer. I can't work with you. Your coalition can't stay on message. You can't all agree what it is I should do. I'm going to go work on another issue where people are aligned and understand exactly what they want to happen and how I can help. The other part of good coalitions is internal, which is trusting relationships, not just the relationship you have with the policymaker, but with each other. What you do and say in a coalition is confidential. There has to be fairness to each other's main concerns. You have to consider why each person's in the coalition and assume good intentions and a benefit. If you fail on these trusting relationships, you will really have to rethink who is in your coalition and how does it move forward. So an outcome of a coalition can be creating more public awareness. It could be for media purposes, salting the groundwork to get ready for more of a policy campaign. You're changing public opinion because you want to build up public will so you can get to political will. You may be assessing political support. This could be something on a ballot initiative. Let's say something comes out about prohibiting vaping to youth under age 21. It's going to be on the ballot. How do you amass political support and public opinion support? It could be a coalition that's working on implementing a policy, and you want to make sure they're not at crosshairs in talking to the grantees and others about the best way to not only keep fidelity to the grant, but also best models. So your inputs involve communications, earned media, social media, paid media. It involves lobbying, and yes, 501c3 organizations can and should lobby. There's some rules around it, but it's not a prohibition. Think about your briefings, your materials, your events, your direct lobby visits, your grassroots mobilization is also key, your activation. Your grassroots are people who have a stake in and support your position, and they are able to do calls and emails and alerts and events. You may also need grass tops for your coalition. These people are not going to come to the meetings all the time, but these are people who have particularly personal, high-level relationships with those policymakers that you need to strategically use. So your coalition is taking advantage of both opportunities and challenges. It is looking at the policy and political landscape to determine how to move a shared issue forward. It's also a place of negotiation, as we talk about in another video, where you're constantly reassessing. After you assess your big ask, how is the negotiation going and how are you keeping your coalition intact as a unified voice? So coalitions come in both formal and informal manners. Some formal coalitions are organizations registered with the IRS themselves. They have chairs and a board that's elected. They have dues, they have real staff, they have regular meetings, they have assigned responsibilities. An example of this is the Committee for Education Funding that's been around for several decades, made up of all the national preschool through higher ed lobby organizations. They work only on increasing funding for education at the federal level. They have weekly meetings of their lobbyists. Members pay dues based on the organization budget, and they have a robust staff. Compare that to the Coalition for Human Needs, which is also a formal coalition. It doesn't have a set schedule of fees. Organizations are asked to donate. It's a much wider umbrella of issue areas. It too has leadership that is chosen from in the membership. It produces blogs. It has meetings of the lobbyists every 2 weeks. And it's multi-issue and a staff that lobbies directly as well as shares information for cross-sector advocacy. There are more informal coalitions as well. They don't charge dues. Their leadership is sort of self-generated and earned, not through a vote. They may have regular meetings. For example, the Non-Defense Domestic Discretionary Coalition originally was healthcare. It then added the Committee for Education funding members. It's now multi-sector. It also has staff and leadership, but no dues. The Early Care and Learning Coalition has been around for several decades. It's had different name changes. It's run by the National Women's Law Center because a particular leader moved from the Children's Defense Fund to the National Women's Law Center, having led that coalition of federal and state advocates. Has no fees. It has monthly meetings or ad hoc meetings. It puts out updates, and it works on both authorizing and funding legislation in the early childhood education space, but it doesn't have staffing and a blog and a website. So usually your coalition's made up of traditional stakeholders, the beneficiaries of the funding stream, the people providing the services, professional associations, think tanks, trade groups, faith and or secular, often unions. But you will also have stakeholders who don't necessarily want to be as engaged in your coalition as other stakeholders. They may want to be there and be very helpful in providing their information, and they're willing to go on lobby visits, but they want to send their own letter. They're not going to join a group letter. So I can think of Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, which is a group of sheriffs promoting greater public investment in childcare and Head Start, and they tend to see themselves as more fiscally conservative, yet they're asking for more money out of Congress, so they want to be on their own letter. They add a special view about why it's important compared to a child care professional association. Business leaders often want to have a nexus with your coalition, but they're not going to keep coming. This isn't the work that they do all the time. They want to be supportive in their own way. They probably go and meet with policymakers separately from you. And in some cases, they have formed their own interest group coalitions. For example, there's Ready Nation, which works on early childhood, which is very senior level businesses, corporations around the country, but they're not going to be seen with the child care people at every coalition meeting. They're extremely important as your grassroots, your grass tops, excuse me. So as you think about forming a coalition, actually one of the very most important questions to ask is, does one already exist? There usually is one. It may be more dormant than at other times, but starting a whole new coalition is a tremendous amount of work. And as you saw, you have to think about resources, not just about issues and internal negotiations. So is this a coalition that you don't belong to and you should? Is this a coalition that is ready to expand as well? If you are looking to form a coalition, think about both long-term or specific action. Are you in a policy campaign for this coalition? Is this ongoing? As I've said, many coalitions go on without end because the issues never end. Others are very specific to a coalition for a very specific bill. There's something in the Higher Education Act around public health graduate students, and you need a campaign only during the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. How does it operate? How formal do you want it to be? How informal do you want it to be? How will you make decisions? Will it be by majority vote? Will it be by consensus? Are you going to ask for resources? In which case, what's the resource allocation? And those can be both financial and in-kind. How do you decide who's in your coalition? Who do you want in your coalition? Who are others that you may feel are too much on the periphery of your coalition, but should have some connection to it? Who brings grassroots that can be mobilized? Who brings grass tops for very targeted impact? And then who's responsible for maintaining it? Who puts out the notice of the upcoming meeting? Who creates the agenda? How do you share? What's your listserv or blog or website? So in all of this, there are also some legalities, and as we enter into an election cycle, it's important to remind yourself that you may be in an entity that's a 501c3. You can actually be in a coalition, you can do direct lobbying, you have to be nonpartisan. Some of your coalition partners may have a different tax status, and they can endorse or oppose a candidate for elected office that you can't. So you need to be very mindful in the coalitions about how you're doing letters, and someone in the coalition has to be in charge of making sure that you are not tipping over the line from nonpartisan to partisan activity. If you're working for government, obviously all of this is very different. Government entities usually have organizations that represent them. The American Public Health Association, there are other associations where they represent state and local level of governments, National Association of Community Health Centers, for instance, and they will be lobbying on your behalf, and you can connect up with them as well. But you need to be very careful if you're working for government about all your work in advocacy, but it is absolutely doable, and you should be doing it through a coalition and not on your own out there as a separate entity that could end up conflicting with the larger, more intentional strategy of the policy advocacy.